baby really hurt me, crying in the taxi. He don't wanna know me, says he made the big mistake of dancing in my store. Says he was bored. Since I guess I'll go home into the arms of the girl that I love. The only love I would have is screwed up. She's so hard to please, but she's a force. So I do my best to meet her demands, play a romance, a slow dance in the living room, but all of the strangers see is one girl swaying alone, stroking her cheek, and they say, you're a little much for me. You're a little much for me. So they pull back, make other plans. I understand I'm a liability. Yes, I'll make you leave. I'm a little much for everyone. The truth is, I am a toy that people enjoy till all of the tricks don't work anymore. Then you're bored of me. I know that it's exciting running through the night, but every perfect summer is eating me alive until you're gone. Better on my own, and they say you're a little much for me. You're a liability. You're a little much for me. So they pull back, make other plans. I understand I'm a liability. Yet I'll make you leave. I'm a little much for everyone. They're gonna watch me disappear into the sun. You're all gonna watch me disappear into the sun. Alrighty. Sorry about any squeaky weird noises. I haven't performed in a while. But I really love that song for a lot of different reasons, but the main one is just kind of the meaning. And for those who couldn't exactly understand the pronunciation or had a trouble understanding it, really, Lorde wrote this song during a very critical breakup when she was dumped. And the reasoning behind that breakup was because in her partner's eyes, she was a liability, an obligation, too much of a burden. And the song is less about that and more about the way she processed that and the way it made her feel and the way that she wanted to work through that. And I think that's why the end of the song is probably the most beautiful part, which is you're all going to watch me walk into the sun, which is like, it's a hopeful nod to, you know, moving forward and, you know, feeling validated in your struggle. And I remember one of the most devastating things that happened besides the shooting and almost losing my life was after the shooting. I was actually, I was cheated on by a partner of 3.5 years. And he cheated on me with my best friend. And that was really devastating. And all I could remember was thinking, like, I was too broken to be loved. I was too riddled with PTSD and anxiety and depression. And I was just unlovable because of it. And it was an awful notion to have because it put the blame on me when the ending of our relationship was never because of my own character flaws. It was a situation. It was a vessel for me to grow and for me to heal. And I am certainly better off, as you might imagine. And when I was alone, which was probably the hardest part about being somebody who survived a shooting, was being alone was the hardest part. And to finally be alone and be by myself was a very scary thought. And all I had was, you know, my poetry and my music. And I felt like a liability. I felt like an obligation, because often when I shared my own feelings, and when I do, it's very bluntly, I tend to make other people cry, you know, because sometimes the story, it is gruesome, and it is something that has very scary details. And I often feel like my pain is something that I never want to transfer onto someone else. And through music, I can turn my pain and my suffering and my trauma into something that's comprehensible and that is pleasing and that is healing and makes me feel validated, because I can create something and I can construct something. And really, because of the ability to process and the ability to be creative and set intentions with that, was I able to actually start talking about my story and coming forward as an activist and really showing the world the harsh, cruel realities of what a gun violence survivor looks like. And that was probably the hardest thing for me to do, but I realized how critical it was to share my story, because for me, the hardest thing about being a survivor was feeling alone and feeling like I didn't have any representation, feeling like I couldn't rely on anybody. And then I realized I had this huge, tragically large community of other survivors who supported me and had the ability to help me navigate through this trauma. And then what I realized was because they told their stories to me. And when I made that available to the world, the feedback was just astronomical. And that's why I think music especially is such an important form of storytelling. And I think because of one thing, I was able to do another. And that's why I'm so grateful to have the ability to be here on this earth and be able to share that with other people. And really grateful just to be here. So that's a little bit about me, why music is really important to the cause that I do. And yeah, thanks for listening.
That was amazing. And our next performer is Richard Ivuzimana from New Haven, Connecticut. And do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself before you perform, or you can perform and talk about yourself, like whatever way works for you?
Tell me so much your story.
I don't really want to say too much. I just want to get to my song. I'm not really originated from the U.S. I'm from Africa, and I came to the U.S. to have a better life, but like I went through like foster care and stuff, and music helps me cope with everything that's going on. And I in my songs I talk about like what I go through and what happened in my life. So yeah.
So that one? Okay.
Did you ever want to know what $21,000 looks like in a single time with this tool?
Money chasing in my jeans, I can slow down. Really trying to get it, I'm on go now. Can change with a journey, I can slow now. Trying to make it right, I'ma slow now. Money chasing in my jeans, I can slow down. Really trying to get it, I'm on go now. Can change with a journey, I can slow now. Trying to make it right, I'ma slow now. Yeah, turn up in the so I've been speeding. Yeah, you know how I rock, I can beat it. Switching in my lanes and my feelings. Remember I was down in my feelings. Yeah, now I'm up. I'm just trying to make it real. Sit in my jeans, man, I'm trying to make it real. Stronger than my demons, man, I'm harder than my steel. Yeah, you know how it's going to consider chasing me and bro. Yeah, right. Trying to keep it right. Yeah, letting the changes, yeah, I really keep it tight. Man, I'm moving for harder, man, I'm trying to keep it hype. I'm going in, I'm taking flight. I'm shining harder than, you know how it go. Ride with the chopper, I let it blow. And it's in my head is, yeah, we'll never slow. Yeah, we'll never slow, huh? Money chasing in my jeans, I can slow down. Really trying to get it, I'm on go now. Can change with a journey, I can go now. Trying to make it right, I'm a slow now. Money chasing in my jeans, I can slow down. Really trying to get it, I'm on go now. Can change with a journey, I can fall now. Trying to make it right, I'm a slow now. Yeah, yeah, never slowing down. Yeah, never slowing down. Never slowing down.
Okay, can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. All right. So I'm going to jump in real quick. So I'm Leonard Jihad, Connecticut Violence Intervention Program. And Richard is my cousin. I call him my nephew because of our age, but he did come through foster care. He lives with my cousin. So, you know, Richard is family. And this is his first time ever performing. So there's a little stage fright, but he did an excellent job. I wanted him to talk more about his story. He has an interesting story of, you know, coming from Africa, seeing, you know, experiencing a lot of trauma and everything. I know it's a little difficult for him to, you know, to talk about, but, you know, I know that the more that he talks about it and, you know, he has to basically get it out and then, you know, he can talk a lot more freely about it. So, so that's one of the things that we're working on. But again, I think he did a fantastic job. I didn't think he was going to do this good, you know, with the whole flow and everything. I think he did a very, very good job.
I think we can all agree that was really good and that was fantastic and amazing. I also wanted to say thank you to both of our performers, and now we're going to have our Q&A. And if you have a question for any of either performers, we encourage you to type it into the chat, and we can also make it anonymous if you message one of our fellows privately. So one of my questions towards Richard or Sam would be, like, how does music affect your community? Like your city or your town or wherever you're from, how does music affect it?
For me, music helps us to cope. Like, I don't know what I would do if I didn't have music in my life. It calms me down. So, yeah.
I know that, like, I would say, weirdly enough, my community didn't really have a lot of, like, art efforts or, like, installations or, like, mini concerts. It wasn't, like, something that we regularly did. And then, of course, the shooting happened. And then all of a sudden, all of this art and music is just, like, happening and is readily available. There was actually a point where we had somebody construct, like, a wooden temple and we burnt it down. So there was a lot of, like art and music that was flowing through a community because it was something that we needed. It was like basically like a topical remedy to the issue that we were having, and it was a way to, like, distract us from kind of, like, the larger problem at hand, which was, you know, the shooting. So it's kind of one of those things where it wasn't there and then it was. And it's the dynamic of like the way that people respect the arts now has definitely changed, and it is something that is really respected on, and we always have like new ongoing projects to not just honor like the victims of our like mass shooting in particular, but like all victims of gun violence and violence around this country. And so I think that was definitely like what Richard was saying, a way to cope, because it really, no one really, to be quite frank, really cared as much about the arts or music or all of those things until after. So it was definitely one of those things that it was a reactive response to an issue. So that'll be my response.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's see. Another question would be, what inspires your music, or the music you make yourself, or in sometimes the music that you choose to perform?
It's just like,
I'm sorry, could you say?
What inspires your music? So it could be the music you perform or the music you make. Just like either way.
that's for me, right? I just like it depends, like what's my mood. Like sometimes when I make my songs, it just be on my mood. Like if I get angry, I just like want to make a song, or the way I'm feeling at that specific moment. That's how I make my songs. That's how I make my songs. Like I could be sad, then I just make a song about it. So that's how I create my music.
I'm gonna have to say same. I never like sit down and think, wow, I'm so happy right now, in such a great mood, and I have all these other things going around, and I'm gonna write a song. No, usually for me, like which is sad, and I wish that it wasn't this way, but I definitely only write music or write poetry or create anything unless like I need to, like it's something that I have to get out. And often when you're venting or trying to like release something, it's normally not very good. So it's definitely something that I do to like cope with. And if I'm in a bad mood, or if I am being reminded of something very like traumatic, or like I just don't know what else to do, it's something I turn to. If I want to feel happy, then I usually play other people's music. Because I actually have never successfully written a quote unquote happy song before, which is really sad. But I like, one day I'll write a love song, and like one day I'll write the next, pop anthem. But for right now, it's just like very sad music and poetry. But hopefully once I grow as a person, so will everything else.
Another question that was just asked is, do you guys write music or lyrics first? What kind of collaborations do you think you'd be interested in? So I'm guessing that means like types of music you want to work with, or other stuff like that.
Wait, explain that to me one more time. I didn't understand that question.
So do you guys write music or lyrics first? And what kind of collaborations do you think you'd be interested in?
Like when I write my music, I freestyle first. I gotta make sure like I record myself doing it, because like I be having like too much stuff running through my brain. So when I say stuff, it'd be hard for me to rewind back. So I gotta like freestyle while I record myself, so I don't like lose anything.
I don't know. It switches, because sometimes like I'll hear like one noise and think to myself, wow, that sounds excellent. This needs to be in a song. Whereas other times like a line will come to me, and then I'll find the melody later. So it depends, like definitely. And I agree. I have to, if I'm writing a full-length song, which is kind of hard to do if anyone has sat down and written a song before, I have to record everything, or I literally will be like, oh shit, like what did I just say? I didn't write it down. Where did it go?
Yeah.
So that is definitely a huge tip is like record everything, even though it's bad. Just like have it for reference and know like, okay, this is what I'm working with, and just be brutally honest with your with your content, and don't try to censor yourself. And I think that's a big thing, is like people are often worried about like how their music is going to sound, opposed to like what the point of the music is in the first place. And obviously the way it sounds is really important. I definitely think that matters. If it's not coming from like the heart, and it's something that you're trying to make sound good, opposed to something that makes you feel good or makes you feel like validated or safe, or whatever kind of intention that you're going for, I think the results tend to be a lot sweeter. And I think you can tell the difference between a song that's trying to achieve like the goal of being successful and replayed and listened to, opposed to something that was made because it has a message or an intention behind. So yeah, I just wanted to say
Let me see if there's another question. I don't think it's updating. So a good question that I have would be, is there an artist that either of you seek inspiration from? Because I think all young people, we all have like specific artists that influence us in some way, and I think you guys especially probably have a certain relationship with the artists you listen to. So do you get inspiration from certain artists, and what artists do you listen to?
I listen to Polo G, like Tupac, Biggie Smalls, Meek Mill, and Young Boy. That's who I listen to, cause they got like stories to tell. I like the way they put their lyrics together, and they came from the mud, so I'm able to understand them and their struggles, and that's where I come from. So I'm able to relate to them, and they motivate me make my own music.
I definitely have like, it's like two sources of inspiration. Like I like stuff that sounds good, but I also like stuff that I relate to. So there's just artists that I'm like drawn to because like aesthetically or or from the surface they're just something that's very glamorous and really cool. So like, but don't really necessarily have like a lot of meaning and stuff like that. So like artists like for me like would be like Queen or David Bowie, and all these people had like things to say, but it was more like their glamour that attracted me and their sound, opposed to like what they were saying, what they stood for as individuals. I'm super into like Cage the Elephant and a lot of indie stuff, but I also listen to a lot of like different, it's hard to say, it's hard to put my finger on it, but the other reason is because I genuinely relate to an artist and their message. I listen to Lorde a lot, as you might imagine, because that's what I played, and I'm like blanking on every artist I've ever listened to right now, which is terrible, but yeah, so there's usually two reasons that I listen to an artist: because like they look cool and they sound cool, or because like I was like, how dare you say that? That is exactly what I was thinking. How are you reading my mind right now? I could not relate any more. So I listen to a lot of indie music. I listen to a lot of classic rock and I listen to a lot of rap. And yeah, so that was a bad answer, but I hope you understand what I meant.
Look at some other questions. So this is to Richard. What can people do to help reduce gun violence in your community? So what do you think could like make your community a better place?
I think we should have like more outlets for kids. We should like have like more sports, more community things to make like the community come together. I think that's what we should do. Because some kids, they get tired. Like the corona affected a lot of things because everybody does not want to stay in the house and stuff, so they're gonna like get into trouble and stuff. So we need like more activities for kids, because once they don't got nothing to do, that's when they get sidetracked with the negativity and stuff, and they want to join the bad crowd. So we gotta have like more outlets for kids, like basketball, football, soccer, jobs, music, everything.
I think that oh, you go.
I was going to say, I think that's a great answer.
Yeah.
Another question.
I'm supposed to answer. Sorry, I feel like I'm interrupting now.
Oh no, you go. If you can answer that question. Like, how would you?
Oh yeah. I was gonna say pretty much the same thing, except kind of more on the angle of like mental health resources. I think, especially now during this pandemic, because you literally can't physically see people for talk therapy or like whatever kind of therapy that you prefer. It's been really hard for people to like process a lot of what's going on. And I think mental health resources is just something that should be an accepted like public health service that people can use, and it isn't stigmatized as or you know overpriced to a point where people can't even have it, and it needs to be something that is accessible and like readily available for everybody. And that I feel like is a huge issue in my community, especially because with the tragedy and everything that happened, it was really, really hard to get our community the resources they needed, whether that was like actual, you know, like psychology or psychiatrists or whatever, or physical therapy or any of these other things. And the result, unfortunately, was, you know, like within like 6 to 8 months of the shooting, 2 former students of our school committed suicide. And that's just a fact. And that has a lot to do with the fact that not every single person is being accounted for and is being accommodated. And it's really unfortunate to know that one of these individuals is someone I knew personally and, you know, sat next to in class, and somebody who, you know, you would think that one devastation would end all the other ones, but it does not always work that way. And often people don't understand the cycle of violence, and that if there is one act, there is often another one to follow, whether that is something that is, you know, internal or external in that sense. And in regards to these cases, this was something that was self-inflicted. And mind you, both were done with a gun. And so like, this is just like proof that all communities, especially those devastated by a cycle of violence, need mental health resources in order for them not to enact the same kind of pain onto themselves or others. And that is often will result in much more pain and heartbreak later on if people don't take preventative action before something happens, I think is the issue. And because no one ever thinks it's going to be them. No one ever thinks that they're going to be a victim of gun violence. No one ever thinks that they're going to commit suicide. No one ever thinks for a moment like that they would be in that position until it happens. And then when it does, you have to live your life that way for the rest of your life. And if you don't have any mental health intervention, if you don't have any support, if you don't have any help from anybody else, you are going to suffer. And this idea that like you can get over it, you know, it's all in your head, like, you know, just put on your big boy pants and get over it, is so hurtful and just so harmful to any person who's actually struggling with mental illness. And that's why I think like mental health resources need to be like readily available and accessible for low or absolutely no money at all. But, you know, our government is not so fair with us sometimes. So, you know, that I cannot really comment on, but that is something I think my community and really every community across the board needs, so we can really end that cycle of violence and continue to grow and heal during those times of adversity. So that's how I feel about that.
Another question towards Samantha, this also goes to Richard as well, would be, what is the most important thing young people can do to reduce gun violence? So you said some of this before, so if there's anything new you want to add to like what you think young people can do to reduce gun violence, you can add.
Like just keeping bees busy. Like, yeah.
Okay. Um, so I'll tell you a little bit about the work that I do, so it can give you maybe an idea about what a young person can do, because I feel like as a young person I'm qualified to say that. So after the Parkland shooting, and for the person who asked before, it took me about like 3 to 4 months to fully recover, and I'm still having operations afterwards. So there's a period of time where I was resting after the shooting happened, but then there was a point where I was just pissed off because obviously I was devastated and traumatized, but also all I could ever think was, I don't want this ever to happen to anybody else. So after just within the month of the shooting, March for Our Lives was assembled and founded in Parkland, Florida. After the shooting happened, there was hundreds of national walkouts across the nation that happened, leading up to a march that happened March 24th, 2018, which was one of the largest youth-led marches in like American history. I was there. I spoke in front of 200,000 people that day, and that was one of my first real appearances as an activist. Before that, I was working only with local news stations and local newspapers and telling people my story. That was the first time I'd ever presented a piece of my own poetry as a speech. And so one of the big things that I can recommend is get involved with an organization or a local org. And if you don't have one, definitely start one. And if you don't have one, March for Our Lives has like tons of chapters that you can join, and they have like ignited so much change for like gun violence prevention. Like in, I believe it was like 21 or 22 different states, like there's legislative change for like new gun reform, and like we had the highest like voter registration turnout during the midterm that we've ever had in the last like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years since essentially the last election, and one of the biggest voter turnouts in history during that midterm, and was responsible for actually pulling some politicians off of the ballot for being NRA supporters. So like, I think one of the big things is organizing and actually being actively aware of what your state is doing, what the nation is doing, and how you can get involved. And that can be through protest, like I did. I went to marches, I went to walkouts, I was at rallies. Public engagement is super important, especially if you want a media following. So if you have event, which unfortunately can't do right now, but when you could have and the world wasn't upside down, public assembly is super important. Organizing is super important. Voting is super important. Voicing your opinions and talking to your congressman and your senate and your state is super important. Signing petitions and participating in different organizations is super important. It's not just one thing that young people can do. It's how many things are you able to do is the question. And there's a lot of things. And I think for me, I had the great ability of being able to be an activist who also had the ability to be an artist. And I think that's super important. And if you feel that maybe you're not, old enough to vote, or maybe you are, scared of large crowds or stuff, like you can still be an activist and be an artist at the same time. Like art is a form of activism. And so if that is your route and that is your preferred method, I definitely recommend that. But definitely getting involved with other people, being, engaging the public, engaging on social media and with the media, and really just making as much well-intentioned art that you can for the cause that you really genuinely care about can be just as effective and just as powerful. So that is pretty much a little bit about what I do, a little bit that I can recommend as a young person. I know that a lot of these options aren't accessible to everybody. So if your last resort is social media, please use social media, because it is so important. And if you see something important on social media that needs to be seen and heard and listened to, retweet, share, post, try to spread awareness on issues that you really care about, and people will follow suit. So those are all things I can recommend. And right now, social media is going to be our strongest ally when it comes to combating gun violence and this upcoming election. So that is my piece. This is how I feel.
Another question would be, I think we talked about this a little bit, but is music a big part of your family and your home life, or your culture, your religion, or like other parts of your life before music became defined by like gun violence for you or other things? Was it a part of like your home life or any other part of your life? Because some people grow up in a family where music is a big part of it. I grew up in a family where music is a big part of my culture. So was it always a part of your life, or was it you yourself went out to like learn about it, if that makes sense?
Music always been a part of me. My culture back in Africa, we like to listen to music and we play drums and stuff. So it's a big thing for me. It's always been a part of me. But then when I was able to understand it, I got to love it more.
I would say that, like, even before I experienced the events that I've already described, I was somebody who had music in my life. And before the shooting, I was already a victim of trauma. I was already, a survivor to a certain degree that I would love to explain, but have absolutely no time for. And it was somebody who was struggling with depression and anxiety, and somebody who, didn't get proper intervention and treatment until it was too late. And oftentimes, music was the only thing that I could talk to. It was the only thing that would listen. It was the only person that wasn't a person who actually would care about me unconditionally. And it was something that was really personified for me, especially. And that's why I have so many of these dang things, because in my mind, and I know this might sound crazy and wacko and whatever, but they're like my babies. They're something that I care deeply about, and it's more than just an object to me, because they've been there with me in times where a lot of people weren't. And, they're just hunks of mahogany and, plastic strings, but it's something that for me was when I didn't have the ability to get help or seek help, and when I was in a toxic home environment and I didn't have anybody to talk to in that environment, it was the only thing that I could really rely on. And it's something that I have had in my life pretty much my entire life, and the meaning and the purpose of music kind of evolved as I did, and what I used music for as I grew up changed. Because as a kid, when you're carefree and like things don't matter, music was just like the background of your life, and it was just something that was fun and fresh. And whereas when you grow older, like the meaning of it just changes entirely, and I know it did for me. So yeah, it was definitely something I had a lot in my life. It wasn't necessarily anything that was sacred to my household. No one in my house can sing a note or play an instrument or do anything like that. No one in my family can really either. I have one drummer, and he dropped out of, college for drumming. So, things happen. And, yeah, so, and also I wasn't really, I'm not a very religious person or anything, but in a way, music is like a form of spirituality for me, and it's a form of reflection, and it's a sacred time for me when I am playing. And yeah, so that's really the only reason it's stuck around for so long, is because it has gotten me through some really tough times, and I will, throw everything else away before I throw these things away. So, yeah.
One more, I think this would be our last question. was a question I was going to ask, but is during this time of, Black Lives Matter and what's happening with civil rights right now in our nation, and peaceful rallies and protests and all that stuff, do you guys get the impression that the intersectionality of social justice reform and calling out racism is going to advance gun violence prevention? So basically, how do you think what's happening right now with Black Lives Matter is going to affect gun violence prevention in your community?
This is something I'm actually thinking about very regularly. So as we all know, the Black and Brown community is affected by gun violence disproportionately in this country. And as we also know, they're also affected disproportionately by police brutality and violence. And often for a long time, when we thought about gun violence prevention and we thought about what that meant and what that looked like, we think of things like Sandy Hook or the Pulse nightclub shooting or the Parkland shooting. We think of these mass shootings that amount into a bulky amount of corpses, and we think about it in that premise. We don't think about like the day-to-day, the case by case, the individual. We don't think about the story. We think about the number that stands behind it, and often we avert our eyes if it's something that is too close to home, and we often ignore the stories because either we don't want to hear the truth and the reality of what's happening, or it's actually not being represented at all, and it is not appearing in media, and it is not something that people talk about. And so I remember when I started becoming a gun violence prevention activist, I realized that my story as a survivor was much bigger than Parkland. It was much bigger than mass shootings. It was much bigger than me. It was every single person who's ever been impacted by gun violence ever. And that includes Black lives, that includes people of color, that includes our LGBT community, that always have. But now we're understanding, especially with this shift in narrative, how not just these circumstances that we automatically think of when we think of gun violence, but now we're associating it with being a much larger and broader problem. And I think in general, that is going to be very advantageous, because once we make gun violence, here's the thing, I have to phrase this correctly. Once we understand that gun violence prevention activism and any activism in general has to be inclusive and diverse, we will become stronger as a movement. And the moment that we include Black and Brown voices and our Indigenous people and our LGBT youth, all of these people who are being directly and disproportionately affected by this violence, once we have that representation, once those stories are loud enough and clear enough for people to believe and be morally obstructed by, that is when I think we are going to get some major traction and change, especially with this upcoming election. And even now, I think when it comes to gun violence prevention, that has always been the biggest thing for me, was trying to understand and move past this idea that this was just something that happens to me once and it isn't ever going to happen again to anybody. And I realized that this is something that happens every single day in our country, and no one has done anything to correct it. So with that being said, like, I think this gun violence prevention movement is going to start merging with the Black Lives Matter movement, start merging with all of these, these movements that the Black Lives Matter movement has existed since like 2016, 2015. So like these things are going to have to start merging eventually, because if they don't, we're not going to have the numbers we need. We're not going to have the voice be loud enough. And I think just for constructive reasons, they're going to recognize each other's trauma and their experiences to being pretty much the same. And I think that is going to be the thing that is going to bind those two movements together, is realizing that the trauma and the pain and that PTSD that we often experience, whether it's as an individual or as a community, is something that is universal. And at the end of the day, I think it is the pain and the suffering that we have gone through is what is going to bring us together, but it's also going to be the thing that changes these systematic forms of oppression, and it's going to change our government, and it's going to change the way that we talk about these issues because of that representation. And so in general, I think that is going to be the outcome, is these two things absolutely need to merge, and they absolutely need to be working in conjunction with each other, because gun violence, every single person, regardless of gender, sexuality, religion, race, or ethnicity, like, it affects everybody. And once we start to recognize that, the stronger that we are when we talk about this subject, so that we're not being ignorant, so we're not being closed-minded. And I think in general, these two things are going to start merging, because they're going to acknowledge each other's trauma and have understanding of that. So I think right now it is critical for, like, organizations like March for Our Lives and, the Newtown Action Alliance and Moms Demand Action to be aligned with Black Lives Matter, because this is something that happens to everybody. And these Black lives are being affected by gun violence, much like the kids in my high school did, much like the men and women in the Pulse nightclub shooting. Like, bullets see no color, no gender. Their only intent is to kill. And so once we understand that, and once we align ourselves with being open-minded, then we'll see that merge. And so that's how I feel about the subject. And hopefully you'll see these communities and these organizations and these efforts come together, because we are only stronger in numbers, and we have to create a loud enough voice to be a force to be reckoned with. So that's how I feel about that.
Richard, is there anything you want to add onto that?
No, I think she did a good job explaining it.
I mute myself. So each webinar, we're going to talk about gun violence prevention, like, piece of legislation to stay informed and active. And so today's is obviously relevant to what we just talked about, and it's the George Floyd Policing Act. So let me see if I can make it. So this bill, the George Floyd Policing Act of 2020, it facilitates federal enforcement of constitutional violations. So, like, excessive use of force by the police and, like, state law enforcement. And so it's going to lower the criminal intent standard from willful to knowing or reckless to convict a law enforcement officer for misconduct or in a federal prosecution. So it's going to mean that, like, it's easier to convict them of things they've done wrong. Limit qualified immunity as a defense to liability in a private civil action against a law enforcement officer or a state correctional officer. So they're not immune just because of their job if they commit a crime against a human being. And also authorize the Department of Justice to issue subpoenas in investigations of police departments for a pattern or practice of discrimination. The bill also creates a national registry, the National Police Misconduct Registry, to compile data on compliance, complaints, and records of police misconduct. And it's going to establish a framework to prohibit racial profiling at the federal, state, and local level. The bill also will establish new requirements for law enforcement officers and agencies, including to report data on use of force incidents, to obtain training on implicit bias,
Jeff sent us.
racial profiling, as well as to use body cameras. So it was introduced by Representative Karen Bass from California. It passed in the House of Representatives, and it's sent to the Senate. Currently has no action in the Senate. And we also want to push out, obviously since November is coming up, registering to vote, because this is going to be another extremely important election, just like the last one, especially what's happening with civil rights right now and gun violence prevention, all sorts of issues. And we also have joined the Democracy Summer Movement, and it's a program to rock the vote. So we're just trying to engage people to register everyone and get people to vote so we can have a high turnout in November. So basically just get 3 friends to vote, check your voter registration status, and register to vote. So make sure that you are registered to vote and the people around you are registered to vote, because sometimes it just takes someone asking another person if they're voting and if they know who they're voting for, to just start that process and increase turnout. Let me see if I can.
Awesome, that was really helpful.
So again, we just want to say thank you for coming tonight, and we hope you guys will join us on July 16th for our third webinar of the summer series. And we just want to push out to stay aware of the George Floyd Policing Act, and also to make sure that you're registered to vote and that people around you are registered to vote.
All right, well, thank you. I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thanks so much, Sam and Richard. You did a great job.
Thank you.